everyone, and welcome to day 2 of the Association of State Floodplain Managers annual and national, and for the first time virtual, conference. My name is Shannon Riess, and I'm the Vice Chair of the Association of State Floodplain Managers. I want to thank you all so much for joining our session today. While I wish we were all in Texas right now, the best I can do at the moment is say a warm welcome from my living room, and that I look forward to seeing you all next year in Raleigh. The theme of day 2 here is managing flood risk in a changing world. The landscape of our communities nationwide has very literally changed over the last few decades due to increased development pressures, subsiding lands, and a changing climate. Some of you may know that I'm the program manager for Florida State Floodplain Management Office. Our office sees firsthand how the environment constantly changes the flood risk in the state. And many climate-related examples and case studies come from Florida's changing coastlines. What not everyone knows, though, is that I'm not a Florida native. I'm actually from a small census-designated place called Ellicott City, Maryland. Normally, no one would ever know where that is, while the closest major city is Baltimore, which is only 10 miles down the road. However, I know that everyone seeing this at home probably recognizes that name, though. Ellicott City recently has become known as the town that floods, experiencing catastrophic losses due to flash flooding in our small historic district, both in 2016 and in 2018. And still faces major flooding risks due to the existing built environment, the increasing climate risk, and many other factors. Previously existing as a functional mill town, the water that the city once relied on to operate is now drowning it out. I know the past few years I've come to ASFPM's conference, my little hometown's image has been pasted over many of your presentations. To me, the topics our presenters touch on today speak volumes. We're living in a world that's constantly changing, and our flood risk is ever increasing, not just on our coastlines and here in Florida, but also everywhere in the nation and around the world. A rather severe, yet pretty true, statement taken from an NPR story on Ellicott City's flood disaster is this quote: "When the climate changes and the future no longer looks like the past, people all over the country are forced to make huge, life-changing decisions. There's no playbook for how to do it, and there's no cavalry coming to help. And if it goes wrong, your town can die." There is one thing I would say I disagree with on this statement. All of you here today make up the cavalry. The resources you take home with you today and all throughout this week, and the relationships that you build with each other are part of your floodplain management toolkit that gives you the resources you need to succeed in this profession. I know some of you have already used your connections to assist you in the jobs that you do, and know that you always have the option to reach out. The cavalry is here. It's all of us who are, so to speak, in this room today. I also want to take this time to remind everyone that the discussions we have here today do not stop. We have 14 policy committees that ASFPM continually touches on these issues, and we will be talking about today. It is never too early or too late to get involved, and I urge you all to check out ASFPM's committee pages on our fantastic brand new website at floods.org and get involved. Now, I would like to introduce today's plenary sponsor, Michael Baker International. And representing Michael Baker, here is Dale Gray.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for attending this session on managing flood risk in a changing world. My name is Dale Gray. I am the head of the Emergency Management and Response Office for Michael Baker International in Alexandria, Virginia. Michael Baker International is proud to sponsor this session, and we're equally proud to be a titanium sponsor of ASFPM for 11 years running. 2020 marks Baker's 80th year as an engineering services firm, and for many of those years, we've worked with FEMA to study flood hazards, communicate risk, and work with communities to make them more resilient against natural hazards. In our nation's story, the present time is a challenging one. But remember that protecting communities from floods has been a challenge Americans have faced for almost 250 years. As our country expanded, homes and businesses pushed further into floodplains and nearer to the dangers they present. Every generation has come up against its own unique barriers to progress, and then protecting that progress once it occurs. From trying to tame America's waterways, to harnessing their power, to now attempting to restore nature's equilibrium and ability to self-regulate. Continuing to grow your communities while respecting the unpredictability and power of nature is a balance that many of you strive to maintain daily. This balance can often be upset by the effects of changing weather patterns, sea level rise, and stronger, more frequent storms. Instead of occupying a seat next to our fellow floodplain managers at this year's conference, many of us are at home. The COVID-19 global pandemic has necessitated that we keep our distance from our colleagues and even the very people we need to engage. The job of communicating flood risk has become even more difficult because our audience is already burdened by the simple risk of leaving their homes. Does this mean that everything grinds to a halt? Those of you working in building and zoning offices know that it cannot. So how do we keep pressing ahead with our mission to connect people to their flood risk, helping them understand where their community's hazards lie, so they ultimately make decisions to reduce their risk? Just like ASFPM pressed ahead with this year's conference despite the pandemic, we too pivot. At Baker, we're adopting new ways to keep your mission on track while adhering to the guidelines we must all follow during this pandemic. This session's speakers are going to share their insights, strategies, and tools to help manage flood risk in an environment and a climate that is changing, and in many ways has already changed. Just like generations before us, we face our own unique challenges telling the story of America's natural hazards and supporting our communities as they grow in the shadow of those risks. Now more than ever, we must continue to support one another and our communities as we all navigate our way through continued progress. I speak for Michael Baker International when I say we understand the challenge and look forward to solving it together. Thank you very much for your time, and now I'll hand the session back over to Shannon.
Great, thanks so much, Dale. Now on to our opening plenary session. I would like to introduce our first speaker, Sam Medlock. Sam is Senior Counsel for the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, leading the committee's work to advance climate adaptation and resilience. I also want to remind the audience that all the speaker bios are on the page below, and please look into them for more detail. I also want to remind everyone that we're not taking the Q&A sessions until the end of the session, unlike the concurrence. So please, if you have a question specifically for a speaker, to write that on your Q&A. So now, without further ado, let's get to Sam's session.
First, I want to thank the Association of State Floodplain Managers for adapting to this virtual platform and to you all for joining. I'd like to provide a bit of background about the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis and provide you a bit of an update on our progress and our work. The Select Committee was created by House resolution to develop recommendations for actions Congress should take to confront the climate crisis. Although the release of our report was delayed so that the Congress could focus on responding to the pandemic, this is a good time to update you all on our process so far and on what we're hearing about the range of climate threats and the ways that a warming world exacerbates flood risk. The Select Committee staff and members have held more than 1,000 meetings with stakeholders in Washington, D.C. and across the United States, and reviewed hundreds of substantive stakeholder comments submitted in response to our request for information. Our chair, Kathy Castor, and committee members have traveled to communities across the country to listen to local experts about the impacts of climate change and opportunities to build a cleaner, more resilient economy. To date, the Select Committee has held 17 official hearings and 6 member-level roundtables or discussions in which committee members have had the opportunity to hear from a wide range of stakeholders, including elected officials, tribal leaders, scientists, business representatives, policy experts, public health advocates, youth activists, and individuals representing communities on the front lines of climate change. We know that the climate crisis is already increasing flood risk. Global average sea level has risen by about 7 to 8 inches, with almost half this rise occurring since 1993, as oceans have warmed and land-based ice has melted. Sea level is very likely to rise between 1 and 4 feet by the end of the century, with higher scenarios indicating that a rise exceeding 8 feet is physically possible. Annual precipitation has increased across most of the northern and eastern United States. Over the coming century, significant increases in precipitation are projected in winter and spring over the northern Great Plains, the upper Midwest, and the Northeast. Increases in the frequency and intensity of heavy precipitation events in most parts of the United States are projected to continue. Tropical storms and severe storms are projected to increase, as are the frequency and severity of landfalling atmospheric rivers. These changes are hitting communities, increasing costs, stifling economic development, and straining budgets at all levels of government. Infrastructure across the nation is under stress due to chronic underinvestment and deferred maintenance, particularly in low-income communities. The climate crisis threatens to increase public health and safety emergencies as conditions overwhelm infrastructure of all types, including bridges, levees, and dams. While the investment needed is substantial, the costs of continued neglect are far greater. And as floodplain managers experience firsthand, the human impacts of flooding are also significant. Floods have a way of exploiting systemic inequities, with low-income areas and people of color bearing the greatest share of the burdens. In response to this growing threat, President Obama took specific steps to prepare the nation, including issuing the flood risk management standard as the first major advancement in government-wide flood policy in a generation. But in addition to numerous other rollbacks of climate and environmental initiatives, President Trump revoked the federal flood risk management standard less than 2 weeks before Hurricane Harvey struck the Gulf Coast, causing devastating flooding and many deaths. The Trump administration committed to developing a new flood standard, but has not done so to date. This has caused federal flood policy to revert to 1970s era standards for floodplain management, which is the 100-year flood. Flood risk management experts and business leaders alike have criticized this reversal and continue to call on the federal government to increase flood standards. In January, the president proposed fundamental changes to 50-year-old regulations to narrow the scope of the National Environmental Policy Act, an important law to ensuring that communities have a say in how federal activities around infrastructure, mining, and drilling can affect their neighborhoods, public health, and safety. These proposed changes are under review with the White House Office of Management and Budget and could be finalized within weeks. But even more recently, the president is looking at a new executive order instructing agencies to waive long-standing environmental laws to speed up federal approval for new mines, highways, pipelines, and other projects, in an action that circumvents important public safety considerations for how those projects may impact flood risk and public safety. There are important opportunities for Congress and the next administration to advance a robust climate resilience agenda, including actions to reduce flood risk. We've heard from experts that that agenda must have equity and justice at its core. We've heard from community leaders on the front lines of the climate crisis about the ways that flooding threatens them with rising costs, health impacts, and climate gentrification in areas like Miami's Little Haiti neighborhood, where property values are skyrocketing as sea levels rise and more affluent residents near low-lying beaches seek higher ground. We've also heard that that climate agenda must be based on a comprehensive body of science around current and future flood risk. This is about more than mapping. Governments, businesses, communities, and households need accurate and precise information to respond to climate-related risks, such as floods, droughts, heat waves, and wildfires, whose severity is expected to increase with climate change. This climate risk information, specific, accessible, and actionable information on current and projected flood risk, is critical to inform state, local, territorial, and tribal planning and preparedness. Data and analyses about natural hazards and climate risks are currently generated across multiple sectors, including federal agencies, states and local governments, academia, and private entities like catastrophe modeling agencies and insurance firms. Federal action is needed to further develop authoritative risk information, to deploy that information, including guidance on climate-informed codes and standards in ways that are accessible, reliable, and useful for decision makers across sectors and at all levels of government, from federal program managers to private investors, and from community leaders to families. We've also heard about the need for skilled technical assistance and capacity building for states, local governments, tribes, and territories. Decision makers also need data and information to support potential planned transition of existing populations from areas that are so flood prone they will no longer support vibrant and economically sustainable occupation, to receiving communities on higher ground that have planned and prepared for increases in their population. Since most decisions regarding land use, development standards, and building codes are made at state and local levels, decision makers need guidance on the integration of climate risk information and tools to support longer range planning, taking into account the impacts of climate change that are anticipated to occur over longer timescales. We've also heard specific ideas to reduce disaster risks and losses. Since 2005, the federal government has spent more than $450 billion on disaster assistance. Weather disasters and federal spending on them are expected to increase due to climate change. These impacts are hitting low-income households, farmers, traditionally marginalized communities the hardest, driving a downward trend of livability and social resilience. We've heard from experts and practitioners about ways to increase and provide stable federal investment in pre-disaster mitigation and resilient disaster recovery to strengthen infrastructure, support affordable and resilient housing, and help families, businesses, and communities that are seeking federal assistance to move out of the riskiest areas. We've also heard about the importance of strengthening federal flood mapping and insurance programs to deliver forward-looking projections to help low-income households afford their flood insurance and to expand coverage to reduce uninsured flood losses. When Hurricane Harvey made landfall near Houston in 2017, the heavy rainfall not only inundated neighborhoods, it also flooded the city's brownfields and Superfund toxic waste sites. Immediately after the storm, the EPA reviewed aerial imagery and confirmed what concerned residents already suspected, that Harvey had flooded 13 Superfund sites. The hurricane also led to the release of at least 340 tons of air toxics. And in Puerto Rico the same year, Hurricane Maria caused widespread and long-term damage. Among those effects, researchers found that soil levels of PCBs, toxic chemicals banned since 1979, had tripled after the storm. That same study found that PCB levels in the bodies of local residents also rose significantly. So we've heard from experts about these effects and ways to strengthen federal programs to address them. We've also taken a hard look at the ways that flooding and other hazards collide with the pandemic and other public health threats that climate change will exacerbate. We've heard from experts about these issues. A 2016 climate and health assessment identified 3 primary ways that the climate crisis affects populations differently, depending on their vulnerability to disproportionate, multiple, and complex risks to their health and well-being in response to climate change. First, frontline communities are typically located in areas more exposed to pollution, flooding, extreme heat, and other environmental risk factors. Second, frontline communities face a greater burden of underlying medical conditions, making them more sensitive to climate-related health impacts. And third, frontline communities have limited adaptive capacity to bounce back from climate-related threats due to limited access to medical care, limited adaptive capacity, and reduced economic opportunities. The COVID-19 pandemic has manifested the same disproportionate health impacts that are expected for climate change. Fewer than 40% of US state and territorial health departments have developed plans to prepare for the threats of climate change, including the health threats of rising temperatures, more severe floods and storms, and other climate-related hazards. Disasters take a particularly devastating toll on seniors. More than half of the deaths from Hurricane Katrina were adults aged 75 and older. And people over 85 years of age are more than 4 times more likely to die in a wildfire. More than 40% of the survivors who did not evacuate ahead of Hurricane Katrina were either physically unable to leave or were caring for someone with a disability. And of Americans aged 50 or older, and I'm in that demographic, 15% would be unable to evacuate on their own. Despite these risks, less than 25% of seniors have made plans for how they would respond to a disaster or to a call to evacuate. Although nearly 2.5 million people live in nursing homes and assisted living facilities, preparedness planning is inconsistent across those facilities, with limited awareness and resource constraints often cited as barriers to planning. A national assessment identified more than 300 hospitals and 4,400 nursing homes at high risk of flooding. During extreme events, the health and safety of patients, healthcare workers, and the entire community depend on local hospitals that are accessible, operational, and providing high quality care with capacity to respond to increased medical needs. However, between 2000 and 2017, more than 150 hospitals had to evacuate in response to disasters. So we have tapped the expertise of the public health community and the preparedness community for their ideas on how to advance flood resilience for this important sector. We've also heard from private sector partners, from engineering, insurance, and finance, who bring tremendous capabilities and capacities for partnership to advance technological innovation, create life-sustaining jobs, and invest in strong communities, strong homes, and resilient infrastructure. And we've heard from experts across the range of environmental and science disciplines about the ways that intact, healthy, and fully functioning ecosystems provide protective benefits to reduce flood losses, improve water quality, and complement the built environment, contributing to the wellness and community vitality. So there are numerous opportunities for deeper engagement across sectors, particularly in the areas of research, risk modeling, and resilience finance to reduce flood losses. We want to thank you all for the work that you do every day and for sharing great ideas and input as the Select Committee works to complete and issue our report. We benefit tremendously from the insight of floodplain managers and practitioners on the ground who are the experts and co-implementers of flood risk management policy and law. I hope that you will continue to engage with Congress in the next phase to implement recommendations for robust flood risk policy. Thank you all.
Great, thank you so much, Sam. Now on to our next session. We have Sarah Murdock, who serves as the Director of U.S. Climate Resilience and Water Policy at the Nature Conservancy. All right.
Hi, everyone. I'm presenting to you today, sitting here in my home office, and I'm sure many of you are doing the same. I'm sitting here visualizing, looking out at the conference hall and seeing all of your faces. It's obviously not the same as being there in person, and I'm sorry we're not together in person. I am thankful that ASFPM has turned this into a virtual conference, and I am so honored and privileged to be able to be speaking to you today on this important topic. So increased climate change and development risks are threatening the amount and the function of floodplains throughout the country. And we desperately need these floodplains to remain intact and in fact to increase the amount of functioning floodplains because of all of the critical services these floodplains provide, not the least of which is flood risk reduction. You're all familiar with the impacts and rising costs associated with flooding. I don't have to dwell on this. Average flood losses in the US now approach $10 billion annually. Floodplains help mitigate these impacts and are also critical to mitigate other growing impacts like pollution runoff. Each year, massive amounts of nutrients, primarily nitrogen and phosphorus, flow down the Mississippi River and empty into the Gulf of Mexico, where they stimulate an overgrowth of algal blooms that create an oxygen-depleted dead zone, where no aquatic wildlife can survive. This annual summer event hampers recreation and tourism and jeopardizes the region's $2.8 billion a year fishing industry. Similar algal blooms are happening on water bodies throughout the United States. These are real impacts that can be abated if we invest in protecting and restoring our nation's floodplains. The Nature Conservancy's work around this is focused on driving approaches that, through science-driven strategies, seek to avoid further impacts and mitigate existing impacts to floodplains. We seek to advance smart development strategies that work with nature, not against them. This is the effective and cost-effective approach our nation needs to embrace. Investing in floodplains makes sense because they provide a range of valuable benefits. We know that floodplains reduce flood risk to downstream communities. They filter out pollutants and protect water quality. They also provide habitat for fish and birds and other wildlife. And floodplains can enhance the quality of communities by providing more beautiful areas for recreating and access to rivers and coasts. Investing in floodplains makes sense because it's also important, especially now, as our nation is reeling from the economic impacts of COVID-19, to recognize the economic stimulus benefits of restoration work, including floodplain restoration work. Investing in this work is an important way to generate economic stimulus and jobs. As a result of analysis done on restoration that came out of funding appropriated by Congress under the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act in 2009, this work supports on average 15 jobs per $1 million spent and 30 jobs per $1 million spent on more labor-intensive projects. So we must ask ourselves, where should we invest in floodplain restoration work to avoid further impacts and to advance protection and restoration of floodplains? Central to this question, and at the root of this work, must be sound science and data. And this sound science must incorporate the growing impacts we know exist from extreme rainfall, coastal storms, and sea level rise. We can't plan for, develop strategies around, and advance floodplain protection and restoration without up-to-date flood risk mapping combined with spatial mapping of land use data and socioeconomic data. We need to use sound science approaches and data to map, delineate, and communicate risk. A new innovative big data approach to flood modeling developed with our partners provides floodplain maps for the whole United States. The foundation of this effort is a new large-scale hydrodynamic model created by research partners at the University of Bristol in the UK. Used to create this model is river gauge data where available, borrowed gauge data from watersheds with similar climate, and slope characteristics where rivers are ungauged. What this work revealed is that across the United States, there are 41 million people at risk to a 1% flood event, or roughly 3 times as many people that are currently mapped in the 1% flood area, according to current FEMA flood maps. We've also mapped natural areas in floodplain that are not in some kind of protected public land status. And if they get developed, are likely to incur future flood losses. We estimated the cost to acquire some of this lands using county level land value data and also using an EPA data set of projected future development. With this, we estimated the damages that would be incurred if development proceeded unchecked in these places and future flooding occurred. Long story short, it's more cost effective to permanently protect these floodplains. It would be cost effective for hundreds of thousands of square kilometers across the country. And even more striking, we identified an area the size of Massachusetts where $1 invested in protection today would save $5 or more in future avoided damages. We've also used scientific modeling analysis to measure the effectiveness and cost effectiveness that investments in things like coastal wetlands restoration, enhancement of oyster reefs, coral reefs, and mangroves are shown to effectively reduce wave impacts and help absorb flood waters while also producing a host of other benefits. For example, during Hurricane Sandy in 2012, coastal wetlands in the Northeast prevented more than $625 million in flood damages, according to a study published in Scientific Reports and conducted by the Nature Conservancy in partnership with the insurance industry using their modeling capabilities. And a similar study estimated $1.5 billion in avoided property damages as a result of mangroves in place during Hurricane Irma. And it's not enough that we simply have the sound science that defines the risk and allows for smart planning to avoid, minimize, and mitigate flood risk. We need tools that allow access to the data and ability to analyze solutions. There's a need to understand the flood risk and then access a suite of data to help make choices and analyze nature-based solutions. To make the science and data more actionable, the Nature Conservancy has developed online decision support tools to bring needed data and information to decision makers. And I'm going to briefly touch on 2 such mapping tools that TNC developed that serve to assess flood risk and provide analysis to guide nature-based approaches to reducing risk. I'll first touch on this floodplain prioritization tool. You can access it at fptool.org. This screenshot shows the landing page of the tool and the area it covers, the Mississippi River Basin. It shows the various options related to flood frequency, size of watershed, frequency of flood events, etc. And using the national flood modeling that I just mentioned, this tool identifies places where communities are currently exposed to flood risk and are likely to be disproportionately impacted by future increased flooding. So we developed this tool as a way to prioritize our organizational efforts related to floodplain restoration and also empower state, regional, and local stakeholders to identify and prioritize areas where floodplain conservation and restoration are most needed and likely to be most effective. This dynamic platform enables users to access and integrate multiple data sets in addition to the flood risk data set to provide multiple benefits, such as reducing nutrient runoff, providing critical habitat for threatened and endangered species. It also includes spatial data that maps current and projected future development in floodplains and quantification of the estimated flood damages and population exposed. The tool allows users to interactively choose the subsets of the above data layers of interest to them and view the resulting effects on the portfolio of priority sites identified. Another example of an interactive online tool we have developed is called the Coastal Resilience Tool. It can be accessed at coastalresilience.org. Similar to the floodplain prioritization tool, it's an online GIS-based user-friendly mapping tool that allows communities to assess the risk of coastal flooding and explore geographically specific nature-based solutions that would reduce flood risk. Again, at the base of the tool, it incorporates, in this case, NOAA's sea level rise and storm surge data. It also contains many other layers of land type, land use, demographic, socioeconomic data, for example. And then just like the floodplain prioritization tool, the Nature Conservancy uses the analysis to analyze and determine where investments in conservation and restoration will provide the greatest risk reduction benefit. The specific nature-based strategies differ by states and regions, and you can access these various versions at the Coastal Resilience site. In this version I'm showing here, our scientists recently developed the Risk Explorer application, which maps where habitats provide risk reduction to people and property. The blue areas are areas where oyster restoration and green areas where mangrove restoration work would reduce risks to people. This has helped prioritize oyster restoration work and led to several specific restoration projects in Florida and throughout the Gulf of Mexico. So we've invested in the science and decision support tools. That will lead to successful risk reduction work, right? Not quite. Essential to yielding actual risk reduction investments on a scale that will make a difference is convening robust, collaborative, comprehensive, multi-stakeholder planning processes. They need to include a wide range of perspectives and expertise. They need to address not only flood risk, but also consider additional environmental, economic, and societal issues. They're not easy processes. They take time, expertise, and resources. Equity and fairness need to be fully incorporated in these processes. And we think that consideration of nature and the role that it plays in delivering results needs to be fully incorporated in these processes. The processes done right help drive effective outcomes designed to maximize results that seek to build consensus around investment of always limited funding and designed to maximize multiple benefit outcomes and a high return on investment. These processes should be designed to produce hazard mitigation plans that are required under federal statute to qualify for disaster mitigation funds, that are well vetted, incorporate diverse perspectives and professional expertise from various disciplines. Successfully produced plans will stand a much greater likelihood of being implemented and leading to actions and projects that are successfully advanced. The federal government can and should step up efforts to support and fund these processes. Needed are experts in facilitation and in guiding risk reduction dialogues that lead to successful outcomes. These can't be viewed as nice to have. They need to be seen as essential to yielding success. The Silver Jackets program, supported by the Army Corps, is one example of a program that is meant to support collaborative, multi-stakeholder flood risk reduction planning processes. It receives a minuscule amount of funding, and yet what it delivers far surpasses the funding that it receives. FEMA's new BRIC pre-disaster mitigation program should also be accessed to fund and support these types of efforts. The increased funding dedicated to the BRIC program is a good sign of the increased recognition of the need to invest in actions that reduce and avoid future flood risk. Support for robust planning processes is needed by communities. They often don't have the resources and expertise necessary. And this is especially true for low-income, minority, and more rural communities. This slide shows the stakeholders involved in the Missouri Silver Jackets process, conducting a planning process for Missouri's Lower Merrimack River. It includes 8 municipalities, 3 counties, 7 state, federal, and NGO partners. As part of the Lower Merrimack River planning process, the partners use the TNC floodplain prioritization tool that I outlined previously to create a localized version of this tool. The planning effort covers 115 river miles, a large rural and urban area. In this large floodplain river system, what one community does impacts neighbors up and down the river system. The goal is to get the jurisdictions to work together on issues and projects. This process is unique and important model as it covers 11 different political jurisdictions. The customized version of the floodplain prioritization tool built for the Lower Merrimack with integration of local and basin-wide data has been the basis for planning and engagement and has helped guide flood risk reduction actions, including nature-based strategies. It helps identify where the actions will have the greatest benefit to flood risk reduction, to people and property, as well as delivering other environmental benefits. It's showing where actions like levee setbacks to reconnect floodplains to rivers and conserving floodplains threatened for development will yield benefits. It's helping build consensus around the very challenging decisions on where and how to invest limited resources. So the goal of the science, decision support tool development, and robust planning is all designed to ultimately result in effective investments that reduce flooding risk. So let me finish up with an example of how we then take the science and planning processes to drive nature-based flood risk reduction project work at a scale that will yield significant results. This example is from the Puyallup River in the community of Orting in Washington State. This is a river system that has experienced chronic flooding. During a storm in January 2009, the river crested at 16,900 cubic feet per second. Homes, roads, schools were flooded, and 26,000 people were evacuated, the largest ever evacuation in the state. Fast forward to 2014, where the river again crested, this time at over 16,000 cubic feet per second. Yet there were almost no evacuations or flood damages. The difference between the time of the two events was that extensive floodplain restoration work had taken place in the interim. The project more than doubled the width of the river by setting back 1.5 miles of levee and reconnecting a major side channel, giving salmon a place to spawn and rear, and allowing floodwaters to spread out and slow down. The project also created a riverfront park for the community to enjoy. It was so effective that the National Flood Weather Service no longer issues flood warnings for Orting at 4,500 cubic feet per second. They now issue at a much higher 10,000 cubic foot per second. And this one project is part of a program funded by the state of Washington called the Floodplain by Design program, launched in 2013, that recognizes the benefits of investing in floodplain restoration work aimed at yielding multiple benefits. It has led the state to appropriate $115 million to support large-scale, multiple benefit projects across the state, and it's still going strong. So let me close by calling on all of you to speak up for the importance of investing in the science and associated decision support tools necessary to drive this work, as well as investing in the stakeholder planning processes that form the backbone of ensuring and successful results. And finally, the need to increase funding for project work through various federal agency programs, allowing for successful project investment that yield not only flood risk reduction, but additional environmental, economic, and societal benefits. This will all be possible if we continue to make all of these essential investments. Thank you, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Moving into our final plenary session for today, I would like to introduce Laurie Schoeman. She works with Enterprise, and she works with Enterprise's efforts to preserve and protect affordable housing across the nation from the risks and impacts of natural hazards and a changing climate.
Good afternoon, colleagues. I'm so pleased to be here, and thank you so much, Chad and Larry, for inviting me to speak on this esteemed panel with my colleagues, Samantha Medlock, Sarah, Murdock, and Shannon Riess. This is indeed a timely topic to discuss how do we manage risk in a changing world. Enterprise Community Partners is a nonprofit. We've been around for 40 years, creating opportunity throughout the nation in some of our most vulnerable communities. We have 11 offices around the nation. We also work deeply in Puerto Rico, in the VI, and with communities across the nation in our rural and tribal locales. And all of our communities that we serve and work with are dealing with a variety of issues related to housing and vulnerability and risk. What we seek to do is try to create opportunity through creating affordable and safe housing by promoting policies that advocate and advance the work we want to do to bring our communities more opportunity, to deploy capital solutions to support the communities that need our help, to help them maintain continuity of operations, create leadership opportunities to support thriving communities, and to ensure that our community organizations and partners have the resources in order to deal with and tackle the pressing issues of our day. Enterprise Community Partners has been involved and engaged in disaster recovery and resiliency as far back as Hurricane Katrina. And we know through the many events that we've been deeply engaged in that climate crisis and climate impacts and natural hazards are as much about impacts to affordable housing and vulnerable communities. We know that so many of these events have thrown our communities into terrible, terrible situations and have torn asunder the very ties that link our communities together. Housing that's been destroyed time and time again that has yet to be repaired. housing that's been destroyed, affordable housing that's been lost, that has never yet been rebuilt. And we've seen in time after time, in event after event, that the loss of affordable housing devastates so many of our communities. From Katrina, where we lost 800,000 homes, through Superstorm Sandy in the New York region, where we lost close to 650,000 homes, through the 2017 storms with Hurricane Harvey, Irma, and Maria, where so much of our affordable housing that so many of you and so many of our colleagues have tirelessly built and spent generations to develop have been lost in a day or an hour even. And we know how hard it is to build and recreate this housing. Rampant NIMBYism has created a situation where it's very difficult to build housing. It's also very difficult to find the resources to build affordable housing. So what I'd like to present to you in my panel and our panel is a discussion on how we can ensure that our housing is built in a sustainable and participatory way so that communities are able to withstand the changing climate and changing risks confronting us today. And we work with many partners around the nation to make sure that this work is applicable, relevant, and resourced, from our partners at HUD to Fannie Mae to our partners in philanthropy, from Chase to our partners on the ground, our affordable housing partners. In every community we work in, we work hand in hand with our affordable housing partners to make sure that all of what we do is informed by the very communities that we're serving. We know that the National Climate Assessment that came out last year, the 4th National Climate Assessment, stated to us very clearly on page 1 of the assessment that people who are already vulnerable, including lower income and other marginalized communities, have lower capacity to prepare and cope with extreme weather. We know through our work that these communities may have an incredible amount of resiliency in some respects, but that the resources have not been made available to many of our communities to ensure that recovery happens quickly, that the recovery happens in an expedient way so that people can come home again. We know how hard and how long it takes for many of our communities to recover. In fact, we know that many of the communities we've been working with for 15 years in places like New Orleans, in New York, in Colorado, have yet to recover because the resources have not been available for them to recover in an expedient way. So this has to be considered when we think about planning for disaster risk and a changing climate. Ensuring that mitigation is our clear focus for much of our work has to be front and center. We need to make sure that we get ahead of the event so that we don't have to deal with cleanup. We have to deal with recovery for communities and housing that have already established resiliency measures and strategies that ensure that housing and communities have been appropriately mitigated. So the first thing we always need to consider is how can we make that investment, that down payment in a mitigated situation. We know, and this is very clear as of today, when there are thousands and thousands of voices across the world standing up to ensure that all communities have access to resources, that particularly communities of color are able to access and have resources to ensure that the years and years and generations of disinvestment, redlining, and racism can be overcome. We know that so many of our communities that we work with and serve in floodplains across the United States and the world have been impacted by decades of redlining that have put communities at risk, that have moved communities from areas of safety to areas of flood risk. We think about the Rockaways in New York City, where many thousands of community members were moved from Manhattan's Central Highlands to a community that is literally between a coast and a bay at extreme risk of flooding. And it is due to the policies that were propagated in the 60s in New York that the communities that are in the Rockaways today are at great risk when there is a storm and power shortages go out. They are the first to experience the risk and impacts from Superstorm Sandy or other other situations that put power grids on turn down, and that the cascading effects of such an incident, such as a power loss, can have great repercussions for our community. And we can also say that this is not a situation that is unique to New York City. There are cases and examples throughout the nation where communities of color and vulnerable communities have been put in harm's way through policies that have not been favorable to our communities. And so we're dealing with this situation where we have legacy of disinvestment and redlining, and we also have currently an affordable housing crisis in the United States, unprecedented housing affordability crisis. We know that the majority of our states face between 10 and 15% of housing insecurity for households, with California and New York coming in at almost 20% of housing insecurity. And this is housing insecurity that is formally measured. And what housing insecurity means is essentially that a household is paying more than 30% of their income for rent. We have households across the United States paying 50 to 60% of their household income for rent. Housing rents and costs have exceeded the cost of living. They have exceeded the amount of wages coming into households. So the wages and salaries of households are not commensurate with the cost of housing. And so with this severe housing problems and housing shortage, this is coupled with an extreme risk that many of our communities are facing. So as you can see on this map, many of our housing insecure communities in California are also facing extreme risk for fires, drought, and earthquakes. And you can see that in our eastern seaboard communities of Florida, Mid-Atlantic, and New York, many of those coastal communities are experiencing extreme housing affordability shortage, and at the same time are in floodplains, and at the same time are vulnerable to coastal and flood surge. There is a strong connection between housing affordability crisis and the crisis of natural hazards and climate change. You just have to look at the map. Now we have yet another crisis, the crisis of COVID-19 and extension of the quarantine into the summer, into a storm season that is predicted to be one of our most active yet, with almost 19 named storms, 4 occurring just a week into storm season, with Cristobal landing on the Gulf of Mexico and Florida and the Gulf this weekend, or last weekend. What does it mean for the COVID-19 quarantine to be extending into storm season? Well, what this means is we need to ensure that our communities have appropriate shelters to support folks that may be exiting their homes if an evacuation is called. We also know that people are going to be sheltering in place in their homes. So what does this mean for our work ahead? It means that we need to ensure that our homes are safe and our homes are able to withstand folks being able to shelter in place. And with all of the activity that we project for the Atlantic hurricane season, we also know that we're also facing extreme flooding in the Midwest. We've already seen this occur in Michigan and Missouri. We are also facing extreme fire risk in California, and we are always on alert for earthquakes. There has been activity in Puerto Rico and continues to be activity in the Southwest. And so we know that the coupling of an extreme hurricane season and coastal flooding, coupled with folks sheltering in place, creates a condition for extreme health impacts as well. The spread of illness and disease in the wake of flooding and high precipitation events creates conditions for extreme vectors to occur. And what we know is that mitigating these risks ahead of time is what we need to be thinking about, because we are seeing a confluence of health, climate change, and we are seeing a confluence of the exposure of vulnerable communities to these vectors. And we know that our first responder agencies like FEMA are not able to always be on call, considering where we are in this time of COVID. Many of our first responders are extended and have lost capacity because they've been extended to 50 states around the nation, including territories. So we need to ensure that we have the systems in place in communities so that we can have that support immediately, just so that we don't have to completely rely on our federal first responders as the first response, that we have that capability in our communities. So we're dealing with a lot of different issues. We're dealing with the confluence of a lot of different crises at the time. And so what are some solutions that we can think about as we go forward? So I'd like to go into a review of some solutions that enterprises put forward. And then I want to talk about a couple sort of call to action items that we should consider as a community. Floodplain managers, regulators, policymakers, architects, designers, and home builders. Enterprise Community Partners has been working to support strategic recovery and resiliency for many years. I direct our resiliency natural disaster work around the country, and so I'm proud to present some of the resources that are available that we've developed over the years with partners, one of which is a guidance on how to mitigate risk for multifamily housing resiliency. Many of you work in the space of multifamily support and urban management, and so you know that multifamily housing facilities, which house a good percentage of urban communities, are facilities that need to be addressed, but they need to be addressed in a very specific way. These buildings cannot easily be raised or elevated above floodplain or base flood elevation, so there needs to be an attention drawn to how to deal with the systems, specifically the MEP systems, that are so vulnerable to flooding and other risks. We go into detail into what these strategies might look like to help the facilities both adapt to a changing climate as well as mitigate risk. And there's lots of case studies and real-time strategies that have been deployed in New York, in New Jersey, and around the country. And these strategies are important to consider when thinking about investment into mitigation and policies to promote and sustain urban communities. Our most recent book is called Keep Safe. This is a guide for resilient housing in island communities. This was developed after Hurricane Maria with our partners in Puerto Rico. It is in Spanish and in English, and it remarks on and reflects on the issues facing single family, specifically housing in floodplain communities and specifically in island communities. Guidance in this book has applicability for many communities outside of islands as well. We look at rural communities, tribal communities, communities that are facing extreme risk, a volatile grid, as well as a need to ensure affordable and practical strategies for resiliency and mitigation. And the way that this guidance is set up is sequentially looking at how to design, develop, and maintain a house that is in proximity to great risk, like a floodplain. And so just to take you through the sequencing, because it's important when you consider your work managing floodplain zoning and land use, that the development of a resilient home needs to begin with the step of identifying your risk. Identifying your risk and your multiple risks. We're looking at flooding, for example, in Puerto Rico, and many communities are facing earthquake risk. Many communities are facing high precipitation events as well as wind. And then there are the cascading impacts resulting from these primary risks, such as an unstable grid, a loss of potable water, disturbance in septic systems. So we start with the identification of risk, then we move into fortification of a site where it's possible through a variety of strategies that include urban agriculture. Then we move into building protection and fortifying a housing in the face of extreme risk, looking at roofing systems and anchoring systems as well as foundations. Then we move into passive habitability strategies. These are strategies that will help you maintain habitability in a house that lost power. Then we move into electrical and energy strategies related to generation and backup and efficiency. Then we move into water strategies that relate to wastewater management or potable water development. Then we move into our emergency preparedness strategies and getting ready for storm seasons and other risks. And then finally, we move into what we call community strategies, how to work with the community in time of crisis, before, during, and after an event. And we have guidance on code and how to finance this work. So these are the kind of strategies we promote and advocate that all of you think about when you're thinking about management of communities and floodplains and housing. We also have produced a guide on how to create resilient community centers in the face of extreme risk, where we know that much housing cannot be built to code in the immediate, and we are preparing for an intense storm season. We look at how we can retrofit community centers so that they can be resilient and they can be beacons and anchors in a community. And we've been rolling this work out to our partners in the BI. We're standing up a program in Miami with our partners from the city and many partners, the Florida Housing Coalition from the region. And we've also been looking at temp to permanent housing strategies with partners in Houston. How can we stand up housing that's not only built for resiliency, but is temporarily deployed for long-term affordability? Because we know that much of the temporary housing built around the country after an event stays in place for decades. So how do we make sure that the buildings and the housing deployed by many of you after an event can be able to deal with the affordable housing needs of communities, of households that are so vulnerable because they've faced generations that I've discussed before of disinvestment and redlining and everything else that's come with the current realities so many communities face. So I'd like to move into a call to action, if you will, for all of us to think about as we move forward, to think about how can we more equitably plan for a changing climate. I'd like to remark on and again reflect and acknowledge that the legacy of redlining and disinvestment in many of our communities has put our communities at harm's way. I'm showing a redlining map from 1967 in Brooklyn, New York. You can see that these red areas are areas that have been so-called redlined, or areas where financial institutions and other investment institutions did not invest as a matter of policy due to the perceived risk that cities were proposing, risk that was very much informed by racism and NIMBYism. And so this is an important thing to acknowledge in your work as floodplain managers, because you're going to be walking into communities that you might wonder, why was housing placed next to a river? You may be wondering why there's public housing that is sitting up against a coastline and is in Zone A. You may be wondering why there are no grocery stores in the community that you're working in. You may be wondering why there is so much job loss. You may be wondering why there's not enough housing. And some of what you may be wondering is why there has been such a legacy and how this has put our communities at harm's way. So when we work in our communities, particularly our most vulnerable communities, the communities where we have our communities of color, working class communities, communities of immigrants, that there is a legacy of redlining and disinvestment that has placed us at this point today where so many of our communities are in harm's way. And we need to acknowledge and redress this. And this is what so many of the voices rising up around the world are looking to do. So we as workers in the fight to mitigate community risk against climate change have to acknowledge this. Secondly, thinking about community-informed mitigation planning. We did some work with Jersey City Housing Authority, Booker T. Washington specifically, many years ago after Sandy, and we literally worked with the community residents to build a community-informed resiliency plan for Booker T. Washington, the second oldest housing authority in the country. And we worked with the community residents to map the floodplain, to check the floodplain mapping that our friends at FEMA produced, to make sure that the pools of water that the maps had told us would be predicted were accurate. And the community members told us where the water pooled and told us what the considerations were. And we worked together with the residents to create a community resiliency plan for the housing authority that was responsive. And I think about the quote from one of my heroes in planning, Jane Jacobs, when she said to us that cities have the capability of providing something for everybody only because and only when they are created by everybody. And another piece that she brought up, which is important for us all to think about, that there must be eyes upon the street, eyes belonging to those that we might call the proprietors of the street, to ensure the safety of residents and strangers. And I say to you that the eyes on the street are important when we consider floodplain management and climate planning, because these are the individuals that are aware of all of the changes in the climate that occur and the impacts to housing. This is our citizen science. This is our science citizenry. These are our planners, our partners in the move and initiative to mitigate risk. So make sure that you always inform your work with community members. It will help you at the front end. It'll help you at the back end. It'll ensure you have a steward for your plan. It'll also ensure you have a steward and a partner when you operate, deploy, and maintain that plan. Number three, resiliency is about more than just brick and mortar. When we talk about resiliency of a community and also dealing with changing climate conditions, we need to think about more than just the physical assets, more than just our boilers and our concrete and our windows and our anchors. We need to think about the people that are living in there, operating those facilities. They are the ones that are going to be maintaining those assets and informing, ideally, how those assets are built. We also need to think about our operators, the folks that are going to be in place long gone after the design teams and the ribbon cuttings go away. These are the people that have to wake up at night and deal with a broken boiler or deal with a leak on a Sunday morning. So we always need to consider their input. Also, we need to think about how can we leverage the front end to a long-term savings and long-term financing scenario. So when we look at installing efficiency in our buildings, we can look at how can we save on the long-term energy bills or utility bills. So how can we leverage our investments for long-term sustainability and business savings? And then finally, what is the reputation if we don't do it? If we don't invest in mitigation and don't invest in our buildings, what will happen if the buildings go dark? We at Enterprise own and operate close to 15,000 units of housing, and we know the importance of having housing that's safe, housing that can come online after an event. Your reputation counts in a day and age where social media is always working 24 hours a day. You want to make sure that resiliency also looks at your branding and your reputation. Number four, considering what we've discussed, that there's been a disinvestment in our communities over time, that there's been a real focus on recovery and not necessarily mitigation, that we need to make sure that we make an investment in community adaptation, a financial investment in making sure that communities have the resources to adapt. I'm very excited about FEMA's BRIC program coming out, as well as the funding coming through HUD, through the CDBGDR program, as well as the funding coming through EDA on the resiliency programs. And I'm heartened to see that our partners, our federal partners, are looking at how to make investment in community adaptation and mitigation, and not just deal with recovering, because we know how difficult it is to recover and how expensive it is to recover after the fact. So a strong investment in community adaptation is necessary. And then finally, if we are going to take the trouble to think about creating the most resilient structures, the most resilient and adaptive communities, and building affordable housing and making that investment, we need to maintain and operate every single piece of it. We often see funding going into design and engineering and upfront building costs, we rarely see a set aside for maintenance and operations for our systems and our beautiful buildings that are built. And in the words of my dear colleague, Fernando Abruña, Dr. Abruña, one of the leading voices in Puerto Rico on green building and design, your system is only as resilient as it's maintained and operated. If you don't maintain and operate your buildings and your infrastructure, it will fail. It will never hold up to the design standards you have set forward. Our nation is struggling to face an incredible and almost insurmountable poor infrastructure situation where we've got infrastructure around the country that's been rated D- because it hasn't been maintained and operated. And why? Because there's no financing to do that, or very little. And it's not sexy to maintain and operate a boiler, but it's certainly a beautiful thing when you can come home after a storm event and come home to a hot apartment. We need to make maintenance and operations as much a part of our capital work as anything else. I want to thank you so much for taking time today to be with us, and we've covered a lot of ground. I'm very excited and interested to speak with all of you and feel about how we can be able to make a more resilient, adaptive world that has equity and access for all Americans. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to all of our speakers for taking the time to talk with us today about these important and sometimes emerging issues. So we're going to move into the Q&A portion. So I think that we are ready for that, if you guys are all ready for that. So if we are live and everything's working out, I have a couple of questions for everybody. So I'll start with Sam since she went first. And here's a good general question. What is the Select Committee hearing about the importance of science to help better define the current and future threats of flooding, like MAPS urban flooding, Atlas 14, and future conditions?
Yeah, thank you so much. We've been hearing a lot over the course of the work of the Select Committee about the fundamental nature of science and the need for robust development of science, investment in science through the federal enterprise, tapping the sources of information from across the range of disciplines and sectors. There's a lot of incredible science development work happening at the state and local government level, happening through academia. So we've been hearing about that consistently. The other thing is that we're hearing that policy needs to be grounded in robust science and in a good understanding of where the state of flood risk is currently and also where it's heading into the future. And for tools, technical assistance, and information to be available in a way that's transparent to decision makers at all levels of government, and also for homeowners making decisions, for communities deciding where to build and rebuild. So in our view, it really begins with a fundamental investment in strong development of science and tools. So it's absolutely fundamental to the work that we've been thinking through.
Great, thank you so much. I also got a question for Sarah. How is the Nature Conservancy working to connect nature-based solutions to the CRS program, especially for the open space activity?
Yeah, thanks for that and question. I talked about our coastal resilience mapping tool and the different applications that we have for different geographies. And actually, we have a application that is specific to use of the to open space credit under the CRS program. So we first developed that in North Carolina in Dare County in the Outer Banks, and it allows the community to map the open space potential and then easily download all of the information they need to apply for that credit as part of the CRS program. We also did a study throughout the Gulf looking at open space potential in terms of flood risk reduction and incorporated it into the Gulf version of the coastal resilience tool. So it's definitely something that we've been looking to promote as part of the CRS program. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. And Laurie, could you please elaborate more on the idea of passive habitability?
Sure, thanks, Shannon. That's a great question.
Oh, Laura, I think you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Thanks, Shannon, for the question. So the passive habitability we define in our Keep Safe Guide to Resilient Housing Design and Construction in Island Communities as a design and construction operation scenario that assumes that the power has gone out and you've lost electricity and a power source. Therefore, you need to be able to have a house that's habitable, that has appropriate ventilation, that has moisture control, that has sufficient light, and that has the systems in place for you to survive should there be a power loss. Many communities we work with around the nation, specifically in Puerto Rico, in many of our tribal communities, in many of our rural communities, when the grid goes down, there is no backup. And so we recommend sufficient backup, but we also recommend passive habitability, which is a way of designing structures that allows for the power to go out. And the way to do this is to open up, ventilate the building passively, open up walls for lighting to enter, make sure you have pest management strategies in place that will enable appropriate risk mitigation. But we have to think about designing communities and housing that may assume either power loss in many communities, hybridizing power sources, or basically going off grid in certain cases.
Great, thank you so much, Laurie. And there's been a lot of chat about the idea of equity, and that's kind of been an underlying theme in each of your presentations. So could we each take a spin at the ways that equity and justice are changing flood risk awareness in the nation, or equally how it's informing policy to be more inclusive of communities? And obviously this is just kind of from your perspective or through your own experiences. And we'll just go in order. We'll start with Sam.
Sure, thank you. I would say the work of the Select Committee has been driven through weaving the notions of equity and justice through all of our work. What we've really been hearing from communities across the country is that flood risk is exploiting these existing challenges that so many families and small businesses and communities are already experiencing. And so equity and justice really need to be at the heart of the policy solutions that are coming across at the different levels of government. This is what we're hearing over and over again. And that there's also a need to address this with intentionality in policy, that we can't assume that if we use basic tools like benefit cost analysis, that we're going to see outcomes that are equitable, that we may need to go about looking at those methodologies differently and go after righting some of these inequities with intentionality and real focus. But it's something that is really at the heart of our work. We've been so fortunate to hear from so many frontline communities and environmental justice leaders throughout the course of our reaching out for input. And so I would say you can expect to see good treatment of the subject as our report comes out later.
Great, thank you so much. I'll turn it over to Sarah.
Thanks. Well, I certainly agree with everything that Sam said. And one thing that, I would emphasize is that the issue of equity needs to be woven throughout all of our policies, especially related to flood risk. And it's nice to see reports coming out and information coming out that really highlights the inequities that have occurred related to where these impacts touch down. So I think more of that has to happen to really highlight the imbalance that where flood risk occurs. And then we really need to think hard about how do we address those imbalances through various policies, whether at the federal, state, and local level. One thing that we've done is make sure that social vulnerability index and information is woven into our decision support tools. So you can look at income levels, you can look at demographics and other information that help get at some of those issues. And that's really important to be part of those planning processes.
This is a great question, and I echo what my colleagues Sam and Sarah have already said. And what I'd like to add is, Enterprise works in affordable housing. We work with public housing. We work with housing around the nation that has been built and designed to support some of the most vulnerable Americans. And what we see, and I see over and over again, is this incredible, and I showed a map before, this trend where a lot of affordable housing is located in areas that have been perceived as less valuable than other areas of a community. And what has followed also is not only less investment in those communities, but for housing, but less investment in operating and maintaining and developing and designing infrastructure that can mitigate the impacts of climate and natural hazards to these communities. So you've got the double whammy. You've got housing that has not been designed with appropriate measures to mitigate risk. You've got infrastructure that's not designed, built, or maintained sufficiently to deal with this risk. And then you have a disinvestment in services and education and hospitals that further aggravates a situation that's not healthy. And we're seeing this today in the streets rising around our nation and the world asking for change. I would like to coin a term that my colleagues, I'd like to get your perspective on this, but when we go forward in this work, I'd like to coin a term, reparative restoration. Finally providing the level of reparations and support to communities of color, to tribal communities around the nation, to really make sure that we go a step further and make an extra investment in programs, in infrastructure and housing that will really support an equitable and resilient future for these particular communities. We got to pray with our feet.
Yeah, I would say that aligns very consistently with what we are hearing, and it goes to the heart of that intentionality that I mentioned earlier.
Sam, I'm so excited to hear what you're saying and to read the report, because it's critical that we have a national conversation and really put words to paper and start to really look at the underlying issues that our communities are facing. We're going into a very hot summer here in New York City, and it's a challenging time, and we need to look at the infrastructure systems that will help improve the lives of so many around our nation and our world.
Yes, and Sam, could you share where we can find that report? I know we had some questions about that in the chat box as well.
Sure, I saw those questions, and thank you so much. Again, the report was delayed as Congress worked to respond to the pandemic emergency. We are looking forward to completing that report and releasing that report when the time is right. I can't get out ahead of our process, so I can't see exactly when. I would say stay tuned. When it does get released, which will hopefully be during this Congress, we won't keep it a secret. So I would say stay tuned, and we would certainly be putting that on the Select Committee's website, and I'd be happy to share that link if that's helpful.
Shannon, I do want to point out, we have the opportunity right now with BRIC coming forward, with additional funding coming into that program, coming into our hazard mitigation planning program, coming through CARES and HEROES, more funding coming in. through the EPA and EDA and other agencies to really make a true commitment and investment in our communities. And I'm really hopeful that all of you in the audience that are floodplain managers and planners and regulators and architects and designers will really take this to heart, because our community can make a big difference and a visible difference. And it's as much a part of our work as anything else.
Yes. Thank you so much to everyone who came on the call, and especially to all of our speakers for this wonderful session. I do want to wrap up in saying that we have 14 wonderful committees, just like I said, who speak on these issues all the time. They've been super, our co-chairs have been super active on this chat box. I bet if you ask real nice and get active on our committees, you could probably get some of these speakers back on a committee co-chair call to elaborate on some of these issues. I bet you will. So please get active and involved with ASFPM. We do this more than once a year, I swear. And so on that note, I will turn it over to Sarah to make some conference-related announcements. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Shannon, and thank you to all of our speakers this afternoon. We just are so thankful that you've made it here virtually to present for us. And thank you to all watching, our attendees. We have just been super encouraged the last day and a half now of how we have made this pivot to a virtual conference and have heard a lot of great feedback. So again, just want to thank all of our presenters and our moderators and everyone that has put effort into making this switch with us. Again, want to thank our sponsors. As I said, we would not be able to provide this content to all of you without them. We will be again having our open exhibit hours. It's open throughout the conference, but you can definitely meet both through chat and face-to-face with all of our exhibitors during the breaks between sessions. So once again, we'll be heading in right after this into an hour lunch break, but also spend some of that time to make sure you check out some of those really exciting virtual exhibit booths that they've created. It's very different as we're making this switch, but it's been very exciting to see kind of the new features that they've come up with in this virtual setting. So we've been getting a few questions overall that I want to address. First is, how will I get my CECs? Some of you have seen a progress tracker in the platform. So that will update by the end of the conference, even if you're not seeing it update right now. It will be updated. We will make sure that it's updated at the end of the conference. And we are not tracking time spent in each session. However, we are tracking your overall time spent in the platform. So as long as you spend 12 hours in the virtual conference platform, you will automatically receive 12 CECs. If you cannot spend 12 hours throughout the live conference, there will be an opportunity for you to earn those credits once we switch to on-demand, and we'll be sending information about that. Speaking about the on-demand, so the videos will be available on demand starting next week. So it does take some time on the back end to get all of that transition to on demand. So we will send an announcement once those are all available on demand, but we are shooting for sometime next week that those will be available. For those of you that hopped on last night to our trivia and happy hour, we had a lot of fun. And for those of you that missed out, we have another trivia and virtual happy hour going on tonight, 5:30 p.m. Central. And you can find the link for that on the main landing page under social events. And last, I just want to say we are seeing a lot of activity on social media, a great way to interact with each other because we're not together in person. So on Twitter, you please use hashtag ASFPM2020 and jump in on the conversation on social media. Other than that, if you have any questions, feel free to email conference@floods.org and we'll be able to answer any of your questions there. Thank you again to our speakers, and make sure you head on over to the exhibit hall starting now. Thanks, everyone.